Before sunrise, the skies over northern Burkina Faso were ripped apart. Two missiles, US-made, US-launched, tore into a small outpost. 3 people dead, 7 wounded, and the country's main northern communications link left in ashes. Washington calls it security. Burkina Faso calls it a violation of sovereignty. And across Africa, people are asking, since when does fighting terror mean striking an ally without consent? For decades, Africa has been told it needs foreign protection. But this time, the so-called protector pulled the trigger and lit a fire they may not be able to put out. Is this defense or a message? Because the message received on the streets of Ouagadougou was clear. Our land, our right, our future. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what's one thing you would never let anyone take from you? We want to hear your truth, because this is more than headlines. It's about choice, dignity, and the world you want to live in. This is Africa Daily Good News, reporting the moments that history will remember, from Africa's streets to America's living rooms. We don't tell you what to think, we show you what's at stake. And as the dust settled over Yatenga province that morning, what happened next would take the story far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. 5:42 a.m. The silence of Yatenga's countryside was shattered by the sound of incoming fire. Not gunshots, not warning flares, but U.S. precision-guided missiles. Seconds later, a rural outpost lay in ruin. The government confirmed 3 dead, 2 soldiers and a civilian, 7 more wounded, and a vital communications tower reduced to twisted metal. That tower wasn't just steel and cables. It was the link that kept northern security posts talking to each other. Without it, response times stretch and blind spots open. According to Burkina Faso's Ministry of Defense, the strike came from U.S. Africa Command assets in Niger, nearly 400 miles away. Officials called it unilateral, without consultation, and a breach of Article 2 of the UN Charter. Washington's statement? It framed the strike as part of a counterterrorism effort, but gave no names, dates, or proof. For people on the ground, that gap between what's claimed and what's shown is where trust collapses. In the villages nearby, the blast's shockwave rattled tin roofs and jarred families from sleep. Parents pressed children to their chests, unsure if more were coming. In the U.S., most people might imagine a strike zone as a desert far from homes. But here, it's close enough for fragments to hit a schoolyard. And that's where the question sharpens. If it was necessary, why did it land in the middle of their morning? Hours later, the capital was already shifting gears. Soldiers in fatigues moved through checkpoints, eyes scanning, hands resting on rifles. Market vendors whispered between transactions, and a familiar behavioral pattern emerged: people buying in bulk, just in case. It's a reflex you see in many societies. In America, it might be stocking up before a hurricane. Here, it's bracing for the unknown after a strike. Both are about survival, but one comes with a weather forecast, the other without warning. The choice facing any small nation after such a hit is stark. Stay quiet, risk being seen as weak, and maybe avoid escalation. Or stand up, risk more pressure, and signal that the cost of violation will not be cheap. Burkina Faso's leader had already made his choice. And in the hours after, as the dust from the strike still hung in the air, something began to stir in the capital's public squares. A rhythm of drums, a gathering of voices, the kind of movement that can grow faster than the news cycle itself. By midday, Burkina Faso felt like 2 countries at once, one tightening its defenses, the other filling its streets. On state television, President Ibrahim Traoré delivered a live address, calling the strike an assault on our right to exist and ordering an immediate nationwide security escalation. Border sectors with Mali and Niger received additional deployments. Checkpoints multiplied along arterial roads, and strategic sites from Ouagadougou airbase to provincial garrisons moved to elevated readiness. The first priority wasn't retaliation, it was sealing the gaps. In the capital, the change was visible in both uniform and civilian rhythm. Soldiers in fatigues manned intersections that had been opened that morning. Vendors paused mid-sale to glance at passing convoys. According to crisis behavior research, when people can't control the threat, They search for proximity to the ones who can. In the US, that often means refreshing news feeds. Here, it meant stepping outside to see the security forces for themselves. As daylight faded, Revolution Square became the counterpoint to the fortified barracks. Thousands gathered, waving flags and raising hand-painted boards, their chants carrying across the city, "Our land, our right, our future." The phrase jumped quickly to West African social media, adopted as a rallying tag by cities hundreds of miles away. The crowd formed before the talking points, a sequence that tells its own story. Inside government offices, ministers were already mapping the next moves. Nightly televised briefings to control the narrative, town halls in affected provinces to answer questions directly, and hotline numbers for residents near the strike zone. Human behavior in crisis often splits into two tracks, one for information, one for solidarity. The state was trying to feed both. If you were watching this from an American city, ask yourself quietly, on a day like this, would you walk into the square to stand with others or stay home and follow the updates? The answer isn't about geography, it's about where you believe safety comes from. By nightfall, the military's alert posture and the public's gathering energy had settled into a kind of uneasy harmony. And while the speeches were still being drafted, the message on the streets was already moving faster than any official line. 18 hours after the missiles fell, Africa's political machinery was already in motion. The African Union convened an emergency session in Addis Ababa, one of the fastest in its history. 42 nations joined a virtual summit. The core point was not debated. This was more than Burkina Faso's problem. It was a test of the continent's right to decide when foreign forces cross its skies. Mali, Niger, and Guinea condemned the strike outright. Senegal and Ghana, often in step with Washington, urged a full explanation and respect for the UN Charter. When capitals that usually stand on opposite ends of the table start using the same sentence, something has shifted. On the ground, the conversation moved even faster than the communiques. In Bamako, Independence Avenue filled with people waving red-green flags. In Conakry, candlelight lined the walls of the Burkinabe embassy. In Nairobi, smaller marches cut between matatus and morning traffic. The first thing to change wasn't policy, it was posture. People who usually followed politics at a distance were suddenly leaning forward, waiting to see where their leaders would stand. According to behavioral studies, when people can anticipate risk, they adjust before official guidance arrives. And in much of Africa, the squares filled before the statements were typed. Inside the AU call, aides compared this to past crises. The timeline was compressed, the tone harder. Draft language about collective deterrence against unauthorized strikes gained more nods than expected. The quiet surprise was who agreed. Countries that rarely align on security matters were at least aligned on this. Sovereignty without enforcement is a slogan, not a shield. If you're in the US, here's a question worth sitting with. If your city woke to news of an ally being hit without consent, would you want your leaders to respond within hours or wait for the weekend briefings? Beyond the podiums, the shift showed in smaller gestures. Vendors in market stalls kept working but turned radios up. Parents swapped texts for voice calls, because tone carries certainty that written words don't. Americans often refresh news feeds to regain a sense of control. Here, people walked toward the noise for the same reason. By nightfall, the AU session was on pause, but the protests hadn't paused at all. Drums outlasted daylight, and the chant that began in one square now moved in multiple languages with the same beat. Somewhere far from those streets, another set of cameras was switching on, preparing for a response of its own. 24 hours after the strike, the Pentagon's briefing room was full, but the answers were thin. Spokespeople described a precise counterterrorism operation against an imminent threat in northern Burkina Faso. Reporters pressed for names, dates, and proof. None were offered. The claim landed with force. The evidence never landed at all. At the United Nations, Burkina Faso's ambassador called for an emergency Security Council meeting. For 3 hours, the chamber circled the same divide. U.S. delegates spoke of necessity, African representatives spoke of consent, Russia and China condemned the action outright, and France urged restraint without naming a culprit. The official record was blunt. The facts about casualties and damage were uncontested. The right to carry out the strike was not. Across global newsrooms, the split was immediate. Major U.S. outlets led with the counterterrorism framing. African broadcasters focused on the sovereignty breach. European commentary tried to straddle legality and stability. Nothing about the footage had changed, only the frame around it. And frames decide which version survives the news cycle. Americans often flip between channels to balance information. In much of Africa, people turn up the radio to hear tone before they decide where they stand. On the streets of Ouagadougou, a small cafe turned down its kitchen clatter to let the UN feed fill the room. Customers leaned in, not just to listen, but to weigh the pauses between sentences, reading intent in the spaces where detail should be. In moments like this, human instinct is the same across borders. When certainty is scarce, people search for it in delivery as much as in content. Calm words from the podium steadied the market for a moment. The absence of detail unsettled it again. By evening, formal statements were still circling the same arguments. But away from New York's lights, phone calls were already crossing borders, and discussions were shifting from defending a position to planning the next move. And as the cameras in Manhattan powered down, another lens was turning toward a different kind of gathering, one where the talking points would be shorter, but the commitments much harder to walk back. The surprise wasn't that condemnations came, it was who stood together to deliver them. Algeria and South Africa issued a rare joint statement backing Burkina Faso's right to refuse any foreign military action without consent. Brazil and Malaysia voiced concern about the precedent, asking what it means for global norms if host nations can be bypassed. In Europe, responses split. Some capitals urged restraint, others pressed Washington for a detailed briefing. Governments that rarely share talking points were suddenly sharing the same sentence. Across the Atlantic, diaspora groups left their group chats and went to the streets. In Paris, London, and New York, small but determined rallies formed midweek, not massive in size, but loud enough to push their way into local news coverage. Protest organizers framed it simply. Sovereignty isn't regional, it's universal. Police cordons were routine, speeches short, and the core message familiar to anyone who studies protest dynamics: show up, be seen, keep the pressure steady. What traveled faster than the placards was the phrase itself, with consent or not at all. Media coverage mirrored the global split. U.S. networks kept the counter-terror narrative in the lead. African broadcasters prioritized the sovereignty angle. European outlets tried to thread the needle between legality, stability, and alliance politics. Americans often balanced their view by scanning opposing headlines. In Africa, many listeners switched between radio stations for tone, not just facts, a way to gauge intent before choosing a side. That habit doesn't resolve a dispute, it just delays the moment a choice has to be made. At street level, the human side carried its own weight. A Burkina Faso shopkeeper in Paris closed early to join a march. In Brixton, a nursing aide brought her daughter because history class should sometimes be outdoors. In Queens, a graduate student live-streamed chants from the rally to her uncle in Ouagadougou so he could hear them in real time. These were people who usually measured participation in likes and shares, now showing up in person despite the cold. If you were in their place, would you stand in that square or watch from home? By nightfall, the diplomatic map looked different. Allies hedged, rivals capitalized, swing states tested language that could be read two ways tomorrow. The constant wasn't the outrage, it was the coordination. And while speeches echoed across continents, a quieter metric back in Ouagadougou began to move, one that doesn't chant but still changes the course of a day. The first spike wasn't in speeches or sanctions, it was in prices. Within a week of the strike, diesel had climbed 12%. In the northern provinces closest to the blast, basic food staples rose 8 to 10%. Schools in Ouagadougou shut for 2 days. The government confirmed over 4,000 additional security personnel deployed nationwide, a visible signal that borders, bases, and critical sites were under tighter guard. The most immediate impact was economic, not political. State television launched nightly briefings. Ministers held town halls in affected regions, Hotline numbers were broadcast for families living within earshot of the blast zone. The emphasis was on verifiable facts, confirmed damage, casualty counts, defense readiness, and on countering unverified rumors about a second strike. Approval ratings for Traoré's administration jumped from the low 60s to the high 70s in the same week. What rose faster than the cost of fuel was the sense that someone was actually at the controls. On the ground, daily habits bent under the pressure. A mother counted her bills twice before buying cooking oil, then bought less and walked home more slowly. A teacher locked the classroom earlier than usual, tapping the window frame once before leaving. At a gas queue, a taxi driver scrolled his phone, then put it down to listen to the news on the radio. In the US, most people track rising prices on an app. Here, they watch the shelves, the market boards, and their neighbors' buying patterns. Behavioral studies often note that when people can freeze part of their spending to preserve security, they'll do it immediately, even before it's strictly necessary. That's why markets thin out before supply chains actually break. The paradox was clear. Prices were up, but panic was down, replaced by a steadier, more deliberate vigilance. By week's end, the briefings had a rhythm, the checkpoints a routine, and the city had learned to breathe around them. Yet, as calculators clicked in shop stalls and ministry offices alike, another sound began to take shape. Maps unfolding, phones lighting up in neighboring capitals, and conversations about a different kind of defense. Maps aren't supposed to change with a signature. This one effectively did. In Bamako, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger signed a mutual defense agreement that left little room for interpretation. If one is struck by a foreign force without consent, the others will respond. Officials called it a regional security compact. Observers noted its practical weight. Consent first moved from diplomatic talking point to an operational trigger. Alongside the pact, governments began recalibrating their security portfolios, scaling down certain Western training programs, expanding technical exchanges with non-Western partners, and ordering legal reviews of existing status of forces agreements. In Algiers, a closed-door meeting brought together delegations from Burkina Faso, Chad, and Guinea to outline shared intelligence cells and pooled funding for locally manufactured drones, communications gear, and protective equipment, the unglamorous tools that can decide whether a response comes in hours or days. What looked symbolic on paper had clear tactical implications. The human reaction was measured but telling. Inside the Bamako signing hall, the atmosphere stayed formal. In the corridors, aides were already tapping messages to security chiefs. Radios in roadside shops switched from music to bulletins. A tailor near the market began taking orders for new unit patches. People sense security the way they sense weather, a shift in the air that changes plans for the day. Americans might wait for the evening news analysis before forming an opinion. Here, many decide as soon as they hear a sentence they can repeat. Policy machinery moved in parallel. Interior ministries began mapping shared border patrol routes and harmonizing radio frequencies. Defense committees pulled contingency clauses off the shelf that had been dormant for years. The choice was stark: hedge for flexibility or commit, and accept the costs that come with credibility. The unusual part wasn't the words, it was the alignment behind them. By nightfall, the communiques were filed, the ink was dry, but the meaning was still fresh. In capitals across the region, officials understood that the next test wouldn't arrive with warning. And somewhere beyond those mapped borders, engines were already warming, a reminder that commitments have a way of demanding proof sooner than expected. The next strike didn't hit Burkina Faso. It hit Niger. An unauthorized drone attack killed civilians during what was labeled an anti-terror operation. Within 24 hours, Niger's leadership reached out to Ouagadougou. Cameras captured the moment Ibrahim Traoré stood alongside Niger's president, both declaring that unilateral foreign strikes on African soil would be opposed together. Two leaders, one statement, a line drawn for everyone to see. The reaction rippled quickly. Mali and Guinea issued matching language. Chad echoed the same consent-first principle. In East Africa, Tanzania and Uganda signaled support. Even in states with strong Western ties, lawmakers began debating the oversight of foreign bases. What started as a single incident had turned into a stress test for the rules of engagement across the continent. Policy desks drafted language that could survive both headlines and legal scrutiny, while security advisors weighed how far collective response could go before it triggered escalation. On the street, the adjustment was quiet but clear. Rallies became more organized. Fewer improvised signs, more coordinated messaging. Local stations led with sovereignty before crime reports. Shop owners near government squares prepared for crowd surges the way U.S. retailers prep for game day. Expected, manageable part of the week. Behavioral research shows that when people can fold disruption into routine, they find a rhythm around it. Here, defiance was moving from a moment to a schedule. Diplomatic channels monitored the external impact. Western capitals debated whether stricter intelligence disclosures might calm the backlash. Rivals framed the moment as proof of a shifting order. Swing states tested language that could mean one thing in Washington and another in Addis Ababa. For an American audience, the question is simple but telling. If foreign forces had been based in your city for years, would you wait for a second mistake to demand tighter controls, or would one be enough? And in the most personal sense, the change was visible in habits. A taxi driver in Niamey replayed the joint statement on his phone before his next fare. A mother in Ouagadougou sent her sister across the border a short text, same words here, then went back to making lunch. Americans often wait for the full report before taking a position. Here, people stood together first, then debated the details later. The choice wasn't between anger and calm. It was between standing alone and standing with someone else. By week's end, the borders on the map hadn't moved, but expectations had. Government briefings sounded steadier, crowds sounded clearer, and the slogan that began as a chant was now inked into policy drafts. Night fell without sirens, just the low hum of a city that knew morning would bring the same question again, and already had its answer ready. What began as 2 missiles at dawn ended as a timestamp for the continent. In under a month, Burkina Faso shifted from absorbing a blow to shaping the conversation, and the Sahel from loosely connected to visibly aligned. The immediate gains were measurable. New regional defense pacts, faster diplomatic coordination, and a surge in domestic approval for a government seen as unflinching. The risks were just as real: tighter scrutiny from major powers, more sensitive border politics, and an economic weight that wouldn't vanish just because the streets stayed calm. In diplomacy, momentum is a form of currency. In security, it's also a running tab. Analysts pointed to the clearest change. Before the strike, consent was a clause in agreements. After it, consent was the first point on any agenda involving African security. For leaders, that meant fewer quiet deals. For citizens, it meant sharper thresholds for action. Americans often mark change with a specific date. Here, the day of the strike had become the reference point for recalculating Africa's terms of engagement with the rest of the world. The loss was the assumption that the rules were fixed. The gain was knowing exactly where the lines are now. On the ground, it showed in posture more than in policy. Markets reopened, but eyes followed the sound of engines. Evening government briefings replaced light entertainment for some households. Behavioral research suggests that when people can turn anxiety into a controlled routine, they keep a portion of it alive as vigilance. That's why flags that once waved in protest now hang in shopfronts, not as decoration, but as a quiet statement. The real decision wasn't between fear and defiance. It was between waiting for permission and setting your own boundary. By the close of that month, the map looked the same, but the conversations did not. In corridors from Addis Ababa to Washington, the strike was no longer a single incident to study. It had become the baseline for the next what if. And in Ouagadougou, as another dusk settled in, the city eased into that space between calm and caution. The kind of pause where people decide, long before the next sunrise, what the next day will mean.